Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Vicki Goodman, and on behalf of the Friends of the Semel Institute for Neuroscience and Human Behavior at UCLA and the Resnick Neuropsychiatric Hospital Board of Advisors, it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's Open Mind program with Dr. Anna Lembke, renowned author and psychiatrist whose latest book, Dopamine Nation, Finding Balance in the Age of Indulgence, explores the secret to finding balance in our dopamine overloaded world. Dr. Lembke is a professor of psychiatry at Stanford University School of Medicine, the chief of the Stanford Addiction Medicine Dual Diagnosis Clinic, and also the author of Drug Dealer MD, How Doctors Were Duped, Patients Got Hooked, and Why It's So Hard to Stop, which was highlighted in the New York Times as one of the top 5 books to read to understand the opioid epidemic. She recently appeared on the Netflix documentary, The Social Dilemma, an unvarnished look at the impact of social media on our lives. Dr. Karen Miotto, the director of the UCLA Addiction Psychiatry Service and associate professor, psychiatry and biobehavioral sciences at UCLA, will join Dr. Lembke in conversation. We'd like to thank both of our preeminent presenters for taking the time from their busy schedules to be with us today to share their knowledge and expertise. Now, before we get started, just a few housekeeping guidelines. Our program will run for approximately 1 hour, with the last 15 minutes reserved for your questions. If you would like to ask either of our presenters a question, we ask that you please type your question into the Q&A, which is located at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We'll do our best to get to as many questions as possible. Today's program is being taped and will be available for viewing on our YouTube channel, which you can find on our website, friendsofthesemelinstitute.org. There you will also find a library of videos from past Open Mind programs, a calendar of upcoming events, information about the Friends Scholar Program, and about our Open Mind Film Festival for high school students that will be held on April 28th. For those of you with us for the first time, today's program is part of our free Open Mind community lecture and film series that brings together thought leaders in science and culture for meaningful and relevant discussions about mental health issues. As with public radio or television, if you feel our Open Mind programming provides an important public service, we hope you will consider making a donation in support of it. And now, please join me in giving a warm Zoom welcome to Dr. Anna Lembke. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Vicki, for that lovely introduction. I am so excited and so honored to be here today to tell you a little bit about Dopamine Nation. What I'm going to do is very briefly tell you the story of how our brains evolved over millions of years to approach pleasure and avoid pain, how that primitive wiring is mismatched for our modern ecosystem, and most importantly, what we can do about it. So let's start at the beginning. We reflexively approach pleasure and avoid pain. We don't even have to think about it. And one of the most interesting findings in neuroscience in the last 75 years is that pleasure and pain are co-located in the brain, which means that the same parts of the brain that process pleasure also process pain, and they work like opposite sides of a balance. So imagine that in your brain, in the part of your brain called the reward pathway, there's a balance, kind of like a teeter-totter in a kid's playground. And when it's at rest, it's level with the ground. So when we do something pleasurable, the balance tilts one way. And when we do something painful or experience some kind of painful stimulus, it tilts the other. But one of the overarching rules governing this balance is that it wants to remain level. It doesn't want to be tipped for very long, either to the side of pleasure or pain. And our brains will work very hard to restore a level balance, or what neuroscientists call homeostasis, after any deviation from neutrality. And the way that our brains do that is first by tilting an equal and opposite amount to whatever the stimulus was. So let me give you an example. I really like reading romance novels, something I discovered about 10 years ago. So what happens when I read a romance novel? I get a release of dopamine, our reward neurotransmitter, in a part of our brain called the reward pathway, and my balance tilts to the side of pleasure. But no sooner has that happened than my brain adapts to that increased dopamine by downregulating dopamine production and dopamine transmission, not just to baseline levels, but actually below baseline levels. And one way to think about that is to imagine that there are these little neuroadaptation gremlins hopping on the pain side of the balance to bring it level again. But here's the thing about the gremlins. They like it on the balance, so they don't get off as soon as the balance is level. They stay on until it's tilted an equal and opposite amount to the side of pain. That's that moment that I feel when I finish the book and I want to read one more book because I don't want to leave that world of fantasy. It's the come down, the after effect, the hangover. Now, if we wait long enough and if there's enough brain plasticity, those neuroadaptation gremlins hop off and balance is restored. But the key thing here is that for every pleasure, we pay a price, and that price is a temporary dopamine deficit state. So that's rule number 1 of the balance. Rule number 2 of the balance: with repeated exposure to the same or similar reinforcing stimulus, that initial response to pleasure gets weaker and shorter, and that after response gets stronger and longer. So let's say that I spend now hours, days, weeks, and months reading romance novels. I end up with enough gremlins on the pain side of my balance to fill this whole room. And they're camped out there, tents and barbecues in tow. Now I'm in addicted brain. I'm in a dopamine deficit state. And when this happens, we need more and more of our drug to get the same effect. It's sometimes called tolerance. Now we need to use not to feel good or to feel pleasure, but just to get out of pain and feel normal and level that balance. And when we're not using, we're experiencing the universal symptoms of withdrawal from any addictive substance, which are anxiety, irritability, insomnia, dysphoria, and craving. So that's the second rule of the balance. We do believe that in most people with enough sustained abstinence, eventually those neuroadaptation gremlins will hop off and balance is restored, but it can take a really long time, which is why people with severe addiction will relapse even months after they've stopped using their drug, or what George Koob has called dysphoria-driven relapse. They're using because they're trying to get out of this painful, dysphoric dopamine deficit state. Here's the third rule of the balance. The balance remembers. So those gremlins, once created, never entirely go away. That means that if an individual has abstained for a long period of time and then is re-exposed to their drug, a lot of gremlins hop on that pain side right away, plunging that person potentially right back into the depths of their addiction. Also, amazingly, the balance can be triggered by memory of the drug or people, places, and things in our environment that remind us of the drug. My patients will talk about having euphoric recall from having used their drug of choice, which in and of itself releases a little bit of dopamine in that brain's reward pathway, tilts our balance to the side of pleasure, followed by those gremlins hopping on the pain side, tilting it to the side of pain, and that is craving. And craving can be triggered even by things in our environment. You might reasonably ask, why on earth would Mother Nature make it so that every pleasure has a price and that price is pain? And why on earth would Mother Nature make it so that our pleasures are by definition temporary and we need more and more over time to get the same effect? Well, if you think about the fact that for most of human existence, we have lived in a world of scarcity and ever-present danger, this method or system or circuit of the balance makes perfect sense because it ensures that we will continue to be seekers, that we will put forward tremendous effort to seek out that next reward, and that we will survive as a result. So this balance is essentially what has kept us alive over millions of years of evolution. However, this balance is terribly mismatched for the world that we live in now, characterized by almost infinite access to highly reinforcing drugs and behaviors, including drugs that didn't exist before, like social media, like video games, like all of the online content that we're constantly inundated with. And also, this world has drugified even the types of behaviors that typically are a good and healthy source of dopamine. So, for example, food has become drugified with more sugar, more fat, more salt. Social interaction or human connection, which we know actually comes about by the release of oxytocin, our love hormone, binding to dopamine releasing neurons in our reward pathway and releasing dopamine, which makes us feel good, which of course encourages us to make those human connections. So inherently, we are social creatures. We want to be connected. We need to be connected for the sake of our survival. And our brains get us to do that by releasing dopamine when we make those intimate connections. But now we've got social media, which, although it can be wonderful, can also, in fact, drugify this experience of human connection because it's so much more potent. It's so much more available. TikTok never runs out. If you think about the factors that make a modern drug addictive, it's access, quantity, potency, and novelty. And the enumeration, giving something a number, makes it even more reinforcing. I hypothesize in Dopamine Nation that this drugified world has made us all more vulnerable to the problem of addiction. And further, that in fact, because we are constantly bombarding our reward pathway in ways large and small with these highly reinforcing drugs and behaviors, we are all, as individuals and as nations, driven into this dopamine deficit state, which is very akin to a clinical depression or an anxiety state. I have seen in the course of my career increasing numbers of young people who have every privilege you could imagine, including wonderful families, excellent education, a robust social network, who can barely get out of bed in the morning. And one of the common features that characterizes the existence of many of these young people is that they are spending much of their time engaging in highly reinforcing drugs and behaviors, either online or in the form of drugs and alcohol or often in combination. When these patients come to see me 20 years ago, the first thing that I would have recommended for a patient like this suffering with depression and anxiety would be to prescribe an antidepressant or to recommend some type of psychotherapy. Today, the first thing that I do is recommend a dopamine fast, which is to say I operate under the assumption that the reason that they're experiencing depression and anxiety is because they are in this dopamine deficit state as a result of too much pleasure, which brings us to the interventions for what we as individuals can do about it. Now, what I will not talk about today is what the regulatory bodies, what our school system, what the corporations who make this content, what the federal government can do. It's also importantly a common problem, a communal problem, and there needs to be a top-down solution. But what I'm talking about today and what I emphasize in Dopamine Nation is what we as individuals can do and how we can help our children with this dopamine saturated world. So number one, we can take a dopamine fast. And what I ask my patients for is to think about that substance or behavior that may be putting them in this dopamine deficit state. And you may think yourself as you're listening, what is that thing that you do or that you ingest that once you start, it's very hard for you to stop. You wished you did it less, and you see it having an impact, a negative impact on your life. The definition of addiction is the continued compulsive use of a substance or behavior despite harm to self and or others. And sometimes that harm can be very subtle and not even necessarily within our awareness. Just it can manifest simply as being slightly depressed or being slightly anxious or being slightly restless or not being able to sleep. So what I suggest is a dopamine fast. Why? Because a dopamine fast or abstaining from that substance or behavior for long enough to let those neuroadaptation gremlins hop off the pain side of the balance so that homeostasis can be restored. Why is it important to restore homeostasis? Because without that, we cannot take pleasure in more modest rewards. Furthermore, that abstinence fast allows us to look back and see true cause and effect, which is very hard to do while we're chasing dopamine. Why do I ask for 30 days? Because 30 days is probably on average the amount of time it takes for those neuroadaptation gremlins to hop off the pain side of the balance and for homeostasis to be restored. It doesn't mean the brain is totally healed at that point, but typically that's when people begin to see the sun come out. I also warn my patients that the first 2 weeks are going to be really hard. Imagine the balance again. You take the weights off the pleasure side, you've got all those gremlins camped out on the pain side, and that balance is going to go to the side of pain. So I always let people know they're going to experience withdrawal. But if they can just wait long enough, they will start to feel better in weeks 3 and weeks 4. Now, let me just footnote this by saying this is not an experiment I would ask a patient to do if they had any risk of life-threatening withdrawal from things like alcohol or benzodiazepines or opioids. It's also not an experiment I would ask someone with very severe addiction to do who had repeatedly tried on their own to stop and was unable to. Those individuals need a higher level of care. But for many individuals coming in seeking help for depression, anxiety, insomnia, or just general despair, and or seeking help for mild to moderate addiction or compulsive overconsumption of any sort, this 30-day abstinence fast is a really good place to start. And when patients come back after 30 days, if they're feeling better, what we then talk about is next steps. Do they want to continue to abstain, or do they want to go back to using in moderation? And most of my patients actually want to go back to using in moderation. Not all of them are successful, but one of the things that can help is this concept of self-binding strategies. So what are self-binding strategies? Self-binding strategies are literal and metacognitive barriers we put between ourselves and our drug of choice so that we can press the pause button between desire and consumption. And by just creating that distance, it can sometimes make all the difference. Self-binding strategies come in many different forms. One of them is chronological. So for example, committing to using your drug of choice only on certain days or only for certain amounts of time on any given day. For example, a patient of mine who was depressed and anxious and playing video games most of his waking hours. When he abstained and felt much better, he decided that he would go back to using video games just on Thursdays and Fridays and no more than 2 hours per day. Another form of self-binding is actually categorical self-binding. That's where we say, well, I'm going to use this subcategory of my drug of choice, but not that subcategory. So again, my patient who became addicted to video games said, well, I can't play League of Legends, but it's probably okay for me to play, this video game. He also realized that he couldn't play video games with strangers. He could only play with friends, because when he started to play with strangers, he started to compulsively overconsume. So there's chronological self-binding using time as its construct. There's categorical self-binding, and then there's just actual literal barriers where we take our drug of choice and we don't have it in the house, right? Or we put it in a special room. My patient, he actually did something really clever. He got 2 separate laptops, one for schoolwork and one for games. And that way, both in his mind and literally in his world, he had created this physical division. Okay, so that's the abstinence fast. Again, 30 days is really the bare minimum. And when you're done with that, you can think about, do you want to go back to using, or do you want to maintain abstinence? Either way, self-binding is really important so that you're not entirely relying on willpower to discipline and manage your consumption. Another way that we can try to create and restore our dopamine homeostasis is actually to literally press on the pain side of the balance. This is the science of hormesis. Hormesis is Greek for to set in motion. And those gremlins are agnostic to whatever the initial stimulus is. So when we press on the pleasure side, they'll hop on the pain side. But if we press on that pain side with things like exercise, ice cold water baths, intermittent fasting, those gremlins will hop on the pleasure side and reset us to the side of pleasure. Basically, what happens is we tell our bodies when we expose it to a painful stimulus to start to upregulate our protective feel-good hormones like dopamine, like serotonin, like norepinephrine, like our endogenous cannabinoid system and our endogenous opioid system. Now, one caveat here, if we press too hard and too fast on the side of pain, we essentially turn that into an intoxicant or a maladaptive behavior. Examples would be people who exercise too much and end up with harming their bodies because of their excessive use of that painful stimulus. Another example is people who cut on themselves, which does release endogenous or innate opioids. So in the short term, can relieve psychological pressure and pain. But in the long term develops very quick tolerance, and then there's withdrawal. And obviously cutting is not something that we want to encourage, that we think of as healthy. And that's a result of pressing too hard and too fast on the side of pain. So the key here is to keep the gremlins in mind, right? If we indulge in an intoxicant, make sure you used a modest amount and leave enough time in between for those neuroadaptation gremlins to hop off the pain side of the balance so that homeostasis can be restored in between. And importantly, intermittently and in small doses, press on the pain side of the balance and thereby get those gremlins to hop on the pleasure side and to start upregulate your own feel-good neurotransmitters and hormones. Lastly, one thing that I learned from my patients is that robust recovery comes with radical honesty. What is radical honesty? It's telling the truth about all things large and small. And what my patients in recovery have taught me, and by the way, I hold up patients in recovery from severe addiction as modern day prophets for the rest of us in how to live in this dopamine saturated world. They've taught me the amazing power of telling the truth. It turns out that telling the truth is really hard. The average adult tells 1 to 2 lies per day. I know I'm certainly guilty of that. But if we actively try to tell the truth about everything, it has an amazing effect on our lives. First of all, when we share with other people things that we're ashamed of, we're of course terrified that people are going to run away from us. But in fact, what happens is that people feel not so alone in their own brokenness, and they come closer to us. And of course, that kind of shared intimacy is a wonderful and healthy and adaptive source of dopamine. It's also true that words are tools, and the stories that we tell about our lives become roadmaps for our future. So our autobiographical narratives are not just a way to organize the past, they also guide us going forward. So it's really important to tell true stories, right? Because we don't want to repeat the same mistakes again and again. And this is where the wisdom of Alcoholics Anonymous is so powerful. When people go through the 12 steps, they're really encouraged to talk about what they contributed to the problem, which I think is so vital for telling true stories so that we can have a clear view and make good choices going forward. Finally, I'll leave you with this thought. There's some very interesting science about the nature of truth telling, which suggests that telling the truth might actually improve if we can stimulate the prefrontal cortex. And the prefrontal cortex is that gray matter area right behind our foreheads. It's intimately linked with and communicates with our pleasure pain balance. And when things are going well, those gremlins are being reined in and disciplined by our prefrontal cortex, which is our area of delayed gratification, future consequences, and storytelling. So a very interesting study engaged participants in a die rolling task where they could win money. And not surprisingly, the subjects tended to lie about what the die showed when they cast the die so that they could win a little bit more money. Then those subjects were given transcranial magnetic stimulation to upregulate or stimulate the prefrontal cortex. And what the researchers found is that they lied less in that die rolling game after exposure to prefrontal cortical stimulation. So I asked my colleagues who conducted this experiment, I said, gee whiz, if stimulating the prefrontal cortex makes people lie less, is it possible that telling the truth might actually activate the prefrontal cortex, that telling the truth could actually exercise our brain in a way that could be helpful for being able to manage our compulsive overconsumption? And the researchers indeed agreed that that was a possibility. So one other thing you might try is to be radically honest about everything and know that when you're doing it, you're exercising your prefrontal cortex and avoiding those gremlins hopping on the pain side of your balance to tilt you into that dopamine deficit state. Thank you so much for listening. I'm now going to invite Karen Miotto into conversation.
Well, I'm delighted to be here with you. I just want to tell you, your book, it's so thoughtful, so wise. It melds all the important science with these compelling stories.
Thank you.
And so I read your book, but I also listened to it. And Anna, since you and I were friends, I felt like you were in my living room telling me, and I imagined myself telling you stories along with yours. So thank you for that experience.
Oh, you're very welcome.
A couple questions that, because it really is a thought-provoking book. One of the things you say is that we are losing joy with ordinary pleasures. How do we know that? We're so in our cycles of reward. How do we even begin to think, what joy am I losing?
Yeah, it's a good question. I guess my sense of the collective gestalt now is that people are indeed quite unhappy. And on top of that, they feel guilty about being unhappy because there's this perception that we really do have so much wealth. Even the poorest of the poor, even, given our terrible income gap, the poorest of the poor have more disposable income for leisure goods than at any point in human history. And we all have more leisure time. So we don't only have more days in a given life, we have more hours on any given day. On average, the average American has 4 to 5 hours of leisure time a day. Compare that with basically half an hour of leisure time in the 1800s, zero leisure time for people who lived in slavery. In 2040, we're expected to have up to 7 to 8 hours of leisure time on any given day here in the United States. And those numbers are similar for other countries. So my sense is, in fact, that there is this kind of general despair. You can call it many different things, and people are truly puzzled by it. There's a kind of some people's lives are obviously, there's an obvious reason for them to be unhappy. But I think there are many people kind of going about their day, drinking their Starbucks, checking their phone, watching their Netflix series, and kind of like wondering, gee, what's going on? And so the proposition in Dopamine Nation is that if you are unhappy in your life and you are not sure why, or if your child seems unhappy and ungrateful and not present and you're not sure why, it could in fact be a problem of too much pleasure.
Yes, that makes a lot of sense. And the motivational interviewing self-reflection was, what do I want to change? Why? And what small steps? What are your thoughts about how we can all do that?
Yeah, so, I really do believe in this dopamine fast as a way to get clarity on our lives, because I think that there's a lot of emphasis in mental health now, appropriately so, on what are my cognitions, or what are my emotions, or what is the source of my doing this or my doing that. So our mental health interventions tend to start with cognitions and emotions. But what I'm suggesting is that we need to do much more in mental health that actually starts with behavior change as a way to challenge cognitions and emotions. So for example, this practice of mindfulness, observing without judgment, my thoughts and emotions, which we talk so much about, but which I'm not sure we're making all that much headway for the average person, because we are distracting ourselves from those uncomfortable emotions, and because it's so easy to do that. So what I'm trying to, emphasize here is the need to intervene in the biological system in order to understand it. And somebody somewhere said that if you really want to understand a biological system, you need to change something in the system and see what happens. So I really invite people into this dopamine fast as a way to understand the biological system. I think one of the things I've learned in treating people with addiction over the years is, patients will want to know, well, why am I addicted? Or, how can I get to that place where I want to change this behavior? And, although this is really counterculture, what I often say to patients is, we don't have to wait till you feel like changing. You just need to change the behavior. We don't have to figure out why you're addicted. You're addicted. We need to address the behavior. And again, it's not to say that delving into the deep, undercurrents of why I became addicted in the first place. It's not to say that that's not important. And it's not to say that cognitions and emotions and reflections, like the ones that you would pursue with motivational interviewing, are not important. It's all important, but I'm trying to reintegrate just kind of simple behaviorism.
So someone could say, what do I want to change? Well, I work too much, or I really lead a sedentary life, or I do use too much of this or that. And then not have to reflect, but just say, well, what if I modified that behavior, and what steps would I have to take?
Yeah, exactly. And again, it's not to put the kibosh on reflection, like I'm all about reflection, but it's a little bit speaks to, my training. And also I think the trend of mental health interventions over the last 100 years, which has been more and more focused on what is the root cause of this behavior? What are my, thoughts and emotions? How can I change my thoughts and emotions so that I'll change the behavior or understand the behavior? And what I'm saying is, all that's well and good, but let's just put it to the side and change the behavior. And in doing that, people, they get, it's a revelation, right? So I have a lot of patients who will come into me and say, I'm depressed and anxious, and that's why I smoke pot every day. And I say, okay, I hear you that it feels like, smoking pot relieves depression and anxiety. But after I explain to them about the pleasure-pain balance, I say, I think it's possible. It's a hypothesis that in fact it's smoking pot that's causing your depression and anxiety. And they'll say, no way, there's no way, because I feel better right after my smoke. I say, yeah, but that's just you, restoring homeostasis and accumulating more gremlins. And then if they do the experiment, if they're able to do it and willing to do it, they will come back 4 weeks later and say, I feel less depressed and anxious than I have in many, many years. And it's only now that I have distance from that behavior that I can look back and see that smoking pot every day was actually making me depressed and anxious. So I think this is the thing that I'm trying to get people to consider. You do the behavioral intervention first, and then from that flows the cognitions, the emotions, and the understanding, plus the motivation. So once people have done the experiment, I don't really have to work that hard to motivate them to want to moderate their consumption, because they've seen how much better they feel after they've done it.
I heard you define two different ways. One is the dopamine fast, but the other is self-binding. I won't work Sunday, or I won't have ice cream in my house, that kind of thing.
Right.
And when should there be a fast, and when should there be self-binding, or just whatever works, whatever?
Okay, so great question. So indeed, to do the fast, we already have to do self-binding, right? So for me, as I talk about in the book, I actually got addicted to romance novels. And the first thing that I had to do when I did my 30-day fast was to get rid of my Kindle, because as long as I had that Kindle and I had that instant access, I wasn't able to, manage my physiologic craving, my pleasure pain balance tilted to the side of pain, in order to not continue to read. So self-binding happens immediately. But I think, what is an important discussion here, which has been absent from much of the addiction, let's say, discourse, has been the goal of moderation. And in the goal of moderation, as well as in the goal of abstinence, self-binding is important. And why is moderation so important? Because there are drugs now, like our devices and like food, that we cannot abstain from. We also consider sex to be part of a healthy life. So what makes for healthy sex? So I think this discussion of moderation is really important, and self-binding is key for moderation, because basically what we're doing is we're changing our microenvironment so that we're not relying entirely on willpower. Because remember, as soon as we get triggered and reminded of our drug of choice, we get release of dopamine in our brains. We get a little bit high just by thinking about using our drug of choice once we've gotten into that addictive loop, followed by a little mini dopamine deficit state, which is craving. So we've got to change our microenvironment to minimize exposures to those types of reminders.
Mhm. You spoke of just the power of the 12-step program. If you're not in a 12-step program, what's the best way to have accountability or support your intention of self-binding?
Well, one of the great things about the internet and social media is there's been an explosion of different types of opportunities for peer recovery and peer support with different goals that are occurring in all kinds of online spaces. It used to be that moderation management meetings, which was for people who wanted to moderate alcohol use, not just stop alcohol use, was the only option. And now, in fact, there are, a multitude of online social media platforms, people meeting together to help each other, not just with abstinence from a variety of drugs, but also with moderation. So I think that that's a great resource. And then, this accountability, this gets to the idea of this intentional radical truth telling. So when we are completely honest with another human being about what we're actually doing, how we're spending our time, it's really fascinating how that makes it real in a way it's not real when it's just kind of pinging around in our brains in this sort of silent world that we are inhabiting, but we're not sharing with other humans, which of course with the internet is increasingly easy to do because of the anonymity that it affords. So I think engaging, with foresight and intention into a plan of telling of the truth, not just about, using our drug of choice, but actually everything can stimulate the prefrontal cortex in a way that allows us to hold ourselves accountable. One of my favorite anecdotes was a patient of mine who said, "Oh yeah, Dr. Lembke, when I was in my addiction, I would lie about everything. If I was at McDonald's and somebody would call me and say, 'Hey, where are you?' I'd say, 'Hey, yeah, I'm at Burger King.' If they called me and I was at Burger King, say, 'Oh yeah, I'm at McDonald's.' Like it didn't even make any sense, right? It was just sort of the lying habit. So to pull ourselves out of that lying habit and with vigilance, pay attention to truth telling will upregulate, I believe, that prefrontal cortex, create more intimate human connections, allow us to tell these true autobiographical narratives that then become signposts going forward.
And so often the shame, which you spoke so well. Do you remember our colleague Garrett O'Connor who talked about malignant shame?
Yes.
And he said it's the shame that ceases to motivate.
Yes.
Talk about that in your book.
Yes, I do, because of course, that's such an important insight, the ways in which shame around our behaviors, usually accompanied by lying about those behaviors, perpetuates the maladaptive behavior and also leads to isolation. But on the other hand, shame can be a very pro-social and adaptive emotion. It's probably our most social emotion because the function of shame is essentially to keep people in the tribe and adhering to whatever the group norms are for that tribe. So I think that there are ways in which shame can function very effectively to help people get into recovery. And I think Alcoholics Anonymous is a wonderful example of how they've learned to decrease that kind of destructive or malignant shame that Garrett O'Connor talked about, while leveraging pro-social shame. And they do that essentially by, first of all, just joining is a very de-shaming experience. People realize I'm not the only one. People share their stories. Everyone's like, yep, I get that. And that's incredibly de-shaming. But at the same time, as people progress in their recovery, a lot of what my patients have told me motivates them to maintain recovery is that they would be ashamed to go back to the group and say, I relapsed. So that's an example of pro-social shame. The key to pro-social shame, and again, I think what we need to do is really look at AA as a model, for example, and adapt that to religious organizations, because I've heard from a lot of patients the way that with the best of intentions, certain religious organizations don't really have a pathway for prosocial shame because there's not a clear way forward. And so there's a lot of hiding and malignant shame that then drives people underground or away from that group. So leveraging prosocial shame in a group setting, I think, is really going to be key for providing spaces for people to be open and honest about their addiction and also get into recovery.
And there are so many options: Overeaters, Debtors Anonymous, gambling, so
Right.
the mutual support programs are wide. I wanted to thank you in particular for telling the stories. We often talk about stigma and shame, think of addiction as people who got off track and they can be considered the lowest of the low, but you've really talked about how addiction can cause people to lose their humanity, but your stories really capture their humanity.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And that gives me an opportunity to thank all of my wonderful patients who are willing to let me share their stories anonymously in the book in order to help others. And of course, I talk about some of my own compulsive behaviors in the book intentionally as a way to draw a connection between me and my patients to illustrate that this is not a problem of otherness, right? This is something that we are all vulnerable to, especially in the world that we live in now.
In the dopamine-rich world that we
Yes.
live in now.
Yes.
I see the questions just going off the chart here. So I want to turn it back over to Vicki to make sure we get a chance to hear from the people who have questions.
Yes, thank you. We do have many questions, but first I want to be sure to thank you both, Dr. Lembke, Dr. Miotto. It's really a privilege to hear your conversation and have the opportunity to learn from you. So thank you so much for this.
You're welcome.
Getting to our questions, we have a question from Emelina. What is one thing we as parents can do today to prevent young teenagers, to help young teenagers balance this pleasure and pain center when it comes to social media?
Well, I'm going to quickly say not just one thing, but a couple of things that I think are key. The first thing is that we want to model the behavior that we want our kids to demonstrate. I will get a lot of parents who will come in and say, my kid won't get off their phone, my kid won't get off the computer. And in the course of our conversation, that parent has checked their phone, 3 or 4 times. So it's really, really important that we, for example, ourselves do this experiment with the dopamine fast and really experience withdrawal and see what it feels like so that we have empathy for all of us really battling this problem. Second, I think it's key to have these conversations with our kids, to be transparent and honest about how this is a collective problem, something that we're all dealing with, but that we need to begin to pay attention, not just to how we feel when we're doing the activity, like the social media or the video games or watching Netflix, but also how we feel afterwards, and to think about the cumulative effect of that engagement. And then the third thing I recommend is, if you're able, I really recommend a digital Sabbath or a tech-free vacation where the family together and collectively abstains from devices for a day, for a week, for whatever you can do, and see what blossoms out of that and the kinds of interactions that you have. And then talk about the difference in those interactions when you're not, distracted by devices versus when you are. So that's sort of my very quick sort of 3 things to do.
Thank you so much. Very good advice. Thank you. We have a question from Sophie. In chapter Broken Balance, you briefly spoke about patients sharing that buprenorphine withdrawals are far worse than any experienced with OxyContin and heroin. Why do you think this is?
So buprenorphine is an opioid. It's a unique opioid that's FDA approved to treat opioid use disorder. When you think about the balance and the fact that the balance gets tilted to pain in this chronic dopamine deficit state, that's especially true in severe opioid addiction. And we believe that some people, maybe even with sustained abstinence, can't restore homeostasis. So buprenorphine is an opioid. It goes on the pleasure side and it restores homeostasis and it lets people get their lives back. and I think is life-saving for some individuals. Why is it that the buprenorphine withdrawal might indeed be worse than a withdrawal from heroin or morphine or oxycodone? Buprenorphine has a very long half-life, longer than 36 hours. That's part of why it works to treat opioid addiction. It gets people out of that vicious cycle of intoxication, withdrawal, drug seeking, intoxication, withdrawal, drug seeking, that they can cycle through multiple times in a day with shorter acting opioids. And it levels people out so they're not going through that, so then they can actively engage in their lives and invest their creativity and their energy in other things. However, it does mean that with a long half-life, the withdrawal is also very, very long.
Thank you. Karen is asking, do some people have more of a risk of addiction? And what would some of those risk factors be?
Yeah, the risks of addiction. So it is true that some people are more vulnerable to the risk of addiction. The risks are, I broadly categorize them into nature, nurture, and neighborhood. So nature refers to the fact that there is an inherited component of risk. This is based on family studies, looking at biological parents and grandparents of people with alcohol addiction, and finding that they're at increased risk of developing an alcohol use disorder, even if raised outside of that alcoholic home. So we know that there's a genetic component that predisposes people to addiction. People with co-occurring mental illness are also more vulnerable to the problem of addiction, and that goes all in that nature category. Nurture is about the way that we're raised. If people experience early childhood trauma, they're at higher risk for addiction, probably through some kind of epigenetic changes. Also, we know that when parents explicitly or implicitly condone substance use, those kids are more likely to get addicted. Whereas in this case, helicopter parents are actually protective. So if you have a parent who knows where you are, who you're with, what's in your backpack, what's under your bed, you're actually less likely to get addicted. And then finally, neighborhood. And this is really what we're talking about when we're talking about a dopamine nation. One of the biggest risk factors, so in terms of neighborhood, things like poverty, unemployment, all of those things increase the risk of addiction. But one of the biggest and often forgotten risk factors for addiction is simple access. If you live in a neighborhood where you have access to drugs, you're more likely to use them, you're more likely to get addicted to them. If you go see a doctor who's free with their prescription pads and prescribes a lot of opioids, you're more likely to be on them, to be exposed, and more likely to get addicted. So it's nature, nurture, and neighborhood. I will also add that because we are increasing the quantity, potency, and variety of addictive substances in the modern world, we are all more likely to find our drug of choice, which means we're all more vulnerable to the problem of addiction than we were previously. I used to think I didn't have the addiction gene because drugs don't really do anything for me, and even caffeine doesn't really wake me up. But the truth is I hadn't yet discovered my drug of choice. And my drug of choice turned out to be romance novels, right? But also just in general, drugified social connection is my drug of choice. I would be very vulnerable to social media, which is why I'm not on social media. So I think, what we're seeing with this expansion and increase in potency in reinforcing drugs and behaviors is that we're casting a wider net in terms of the people who are going to be vulnerable. And that's bearing out even with alcohol. There's been an 80% increase in alcohol use disorder among women. There's been a 50% increase in alcohol use disorder among people over the age of 65.
Thank you. Question from Adrian. First of all, thank you, Dr. Lembke. Why would it have been evolutionarily advantageous for our brains to seek homeostasis in our pain reward pathways as opposed to continuing to reward us for finding pleasure?
Oh, very good. Okay, so if you think about the world in which we have inhabited for most of human existence, it's been a world of incredible scarcity where we've had to work very, very hard, walking tens of kilometers every day just to find enough to eat, to find enough to drink, to find a mate, to find shelter. If we were to have a pleasure-pain balance that when we had pleasure, afterwards just went here, we wouldn't be all that motivated. But if we had a pleasure-pain balance that after any experience of pleasure tipped us to pain, that is craving, right? That's desire. That's motivation to work to get more of that reward. And it's really a kind of a genius circuit in a world where rewards are very, very scarce.
Thank you. Question from Steve regarding homeostasis or neutrality. Does that look different in different people? In other words, is one person's neutrality more positive or negative than another person's? If so, how does this relate to depression, for example?
Yeah, great question. So it's absolutely true that like my neutral balance and your neutral balance might not look the same. If you're like an inherently temperamentally happy person, then when you're at balance, that's how you feel. I'm a naturally kind of dysphoric and irritable person. So at balance, I'm kind of a little bit depressed. Also, something may change in your life, to actually like put you, so that you have a major depressive episode, so that you are actually out of balance or not in your regular homeostasis, which then increases, again, your risk of wanting to get out of that potentially by using drugs and alcohol. So there's no doubt that if either at baseline temperament or because you've developed some kind of, physical pain or psychological pain syndrome, you are going to be more at risk for wanting to reach for a substance or behavior to restore homeostasis. But what I always emphasize here is that no matter what your window is into compulsive overconsumption, the gremlins don't care. So even if you start out like with a chronic pain state and you're given an opioid, which relieves it, those gremlins will still hop on the pain side of the balance, and with repeated exposure, ultimately get you in deeper down in that pain state, which is why we see that patients who take opioids, especially at high doses for very long periods of time for chronic pain, actually develop something called opioid-induced hyperalgesia, where their pain gets worse and they even have pain in parts of their body they didn't have before. Why? Because of the gremlins, because of neuroadaptation, because we reset our pain thresholds with repeated exposure to these highly reinforcing, i.e. addictive drugs and behavior.
Another question, what strategies exist to press on the pain lever if you're already feeling depressed? How do you get enough energy, willingness to show up for exercise, etc.?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's really, really hard because, of course, one of the hallmarks of being depressed is that you don't really feel like doing anything. But I hope that what, these ideas will help with is a frame shift around the potential benefits of forcing ourselves to do things that are especially embodied difficult things to do, like exercise, like ice cold water baths, but also psychologically difficult things, forcing ourselves to go out and connect with people, which can especially be hard, after so much time with sheltering in place and COVID and all. And I think it's a worthy frame shift, because I know in the time that I've been practicing psychiatry, we have developed a culture around which we have come to believe that experiencing pain in any form is actually dangerous, and that this pain will not just be painful in the moment, but will set us up for future pain in the form of post-traumatic stress disorder or centralizing pain syndrome, so that people have become afraid of pain. And so this, I hope, is an attempt to sort of shift that narrative and shift that conversation. And I had a patient, a reader actually, who reached out to me and said he was trying to quit smoking. And now whenever he felt the pain of physical craving for a cigarette, he just kind of imagined the gremlins jumping up and down on the pain side of his balance. And that kind of was helpful to him, which that's exactly what I want. I want people to sort of rethink the meaning and purpose of pain in their lives.
Thank you. Another question from David. Dr. Lembke, can you talk more about what you say to patients who are unable or unwilling to try the 30-day dopamine withdrawal experiment? What therapeutic techniques are effective?
Yeah, so one of the things that I've found is especially helpful for young people, and I've seen this with so many different young people that I really think there's something powerful here, is I ask them to conceive of the long arc of their lives. And so let's say I suggest the 30-day dopamine, because they say, no, I don't want to do that. And I said, okay. And they say, okay, well, do you still want to be smoking pot like this, or drinking like this, or playing video games like this 10 years from now. So let's say they're 20 and they imagine themselves as a 30-year-old. No, because at 30, they're going to be doing, this and that. And so, no, I don't want to, I'm not going to be smoking like this at 30, or I'm not going to be, spending my time like this. I said, okay. So we know 30, you're going to want to quit. How about 5 years from now? 25. No, don't want to be doing this at 25. Okay. So, and I just keep going like that until we get to the place where somehow right now and this change that they want to make in the future converge. And very often just the process of doing that, having people reflect on the long arc of their lives can be transformative and get them to say, well, if I'm going to do it in 5 years, why not try it now? The other thing too is one of the reasons to ask for 30 days is because 30 days is not a lifetime, right? 30 days is an amount of time that people can really wrap their head around. But there's a fascinating experiment by Warren Bickel and his team where they said to participants or subjects in the experiment, they prompted them to reflect on their lives. And they said, in the future, so the prompt was something like they had to complete the sentence, in the future, I plan to. And what they found is that in healthy controls, the prompt elicited a statement about a future that was like at least 10 or 15 years in the future. When they gave the same prompt, in the future, I plan to people who were addicted, it often didn't go beyond 6 to 12 months. So there's something very strange that happens in the brain with our relationship to time and our future when we are in an addiction, where we really cannot or do not voluntarily reflect on the long view. By prompting people and patients to do that, it can often get them out of that space and then cause them to be motivated to make a change.
Thank you. We have time for one more question from Marcia. How do you address a dopamine fast for someone with food addiction? Unlike an addiction to social media or gaming, food is required for life.
Yes, great. And very true. And I will just say that there's a lot of interesting movement now in the world of food addiction to actually have food addiction be classified as an addiction in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. We don't have it now. We have eating disorders, but we don't have food addiction. Basically, this gets into categorical self-minding. So obviously, it's not that you would not eat food. It's that you would determine which are the foods that I'm addicted to. What does that look like? Once I start, I can't stop. It's a continued compulsive engagement and mental preoccupation despite harm and despite my desire to not use. And then you don't eat those foods. You essentially avoid those foods for 30 days. And very often it's things like sugar, where people will do a sugar fast for 30 days. And then oftentimes people feel so much better not having sugar, although it's really hard in our culture to avoid sugar because it's like even in bread. But when people can get through that, which I think is really hard, that's a hard one for me personally to do. They feel so much better that then again, they're motivated to continue that moving forward.
Thank you so much for this really informative and inspiring discussion. And thank you for writing your book to educate us all. And I highly recommend that everybody get a copy of Dopamine Nation. Dr. Lembke, thank you so much. Dr. Miotto, thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, Karen.
Thank you for the privilege of your time, for allowing us to learn from you. Thank you to everybody who's tuned in today. We look forward to seeing everybody back on Wednesday, March 30th. When we'll welcome Andrea Sonnenberg, the creator and host of the podcast, Getting Through Stories of Resilience. And you'll have the opportunity to hear young people with mental health challenges who have participated in her podcast. And we look forward to seeing everybody then. So thank you so much. Thank you for being part of our Open Mind community. And good night. Stay well, stay healthy.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.